Welcome to the Reluctant Christian Feminist. I'm Kate here, and I have a very special guest today named Ruth. We're going to talk about a really difficult topic, and that is how the church can help victims of abuse. So, Ruth, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Ruth Barron. I have a degree in English and psychology with a master's in Christian doctrine. And I'm passionate about issues of abuse and trauma and the intersection with church polity and Christian doctrine. So that's become a specialty of mine, looking at the intersection there.
Yeah, and this is not a very easy topic to dive into, is it?
No, it's very, very complicated.
Yeah, very complicated.
And very hard for people to sit with and
Yeah.
to hear.
And this is a discussion that isn't just for victims. This is a discussion for anybody who may know a victim, which is pretty much everybody in the world, right?
Yes, definitely. I've got a lot of statistics, and abuse, I would say, is a pandemic. It's not localized, it's not small. It's epidemic and pandemic in proportions.
Yeah, I agree. I think the more that I've looked into it, it's almost discouraging to even try to address such a topic because it is so widespread, and it happens to some of the victims that are most afraid to speak out, like children and people who don't have power. So let's start with talking about what abuse is.
Yeah, I think that's very difficult for people to grasp. And I've had a lot of people tell me, well, that wasn't really abuse, when it really was abuse. People don't know how to identify abuse. And so often, we're thinking only sexual abuse or, being physically hitting. And often we're thinking it's just minors who can be abused, and not recognizing that adults can be abused as well. And so abuse, we have to understand that abuse is about power differentials. Abuse is about power and control. And when you have someone with an incredible power who is no longer allowing those under their power to be human, to have their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own personality, that is abuse. So I think it's really important to recognize that aspect of abuse. Diane Langberg talks about that. She says that she's a researcher who has extensively interviewed victims from around the world, and she says that abuse damages three major aspects in victims' lives, and that is their voice. It doesn't allow them to have a voice. Abuse damages their relationships. It breaks up their connection to those around them. And she says that she doesn't use this word, but I think a good word for what she's describing is agency. It doesn't allow victims to have any influence and to change the world around them.
Well, that's, kind of an interesting way to look at abuse, because now it is more than just like what happens to somebody, like the sexual abuse or financial abuse or all the different types of verbal abuse or physical abuse. Now it starts looking like ageism, sexism, racism, where people have this differential. I've got a power over you, so I'm not going to hire you. I'm not going to acknowledge you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's really hard for people to grasp. I think we want it to be simpler. We want it to be a smaller problem than what it is. When we realize that a lot of our systems actually perpetuate abuse, it feels threatening, because then we have to address those systems. And so it's very difficult for people. I remember one conversation with my sister-in-law where she was complaining that I was posting too much on social justice things, and she was like, I don't think you understand what abuse is. and it was just this interesting moment. And what I came to realize is that she has drawn this boundary. This is what abuse is. Once you cross this line, anything up to that line is not abuse. But if that line is that small, how easy is it to just cross over the line? If everything up to that line. It's
Yeah.
perfectly good, perfectly healthy, perfectly innocent, and there's just this tiny line to cross over and you get to abuse. And it's really, really easy to cross over that line. And we need to have a broader line. We need to have more of an understanding of what is taking you in a direction that will end in some of these catastrophic abuse situations. We shouldn't be going right up to that line.
Yeah, I think that you're right, and I think the more that I'm hearing stuff like that, it destroys my own sense of understanding of the world because it's like, so the systems that I was raised with may not be the right system. So what is the right system? So for instance, we talk about abuse of power, but power in itself is not a bad thing.
No.
So, but it can definitely be seen as like, I don't want to have power over me. And clearly, we are called to be submitted to each other, which is a different type of submission, I think, than sometimes we understand. Submission to God, and as parents, we're actually have power over our children. So, what
Mhm.
what is your relationship with power? Your thoughts about how power can be used for good, or how power is to be maybe stepped into.
Yeah, I think Jesus actually is a really good example for
Yeah.
me in that Jesus had incredible power. And I mean, the Bible talks about how he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, and he emptied himself. But he also raised the disciples, right? There was a passage, he says, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. He empowered them, and his wasn't a power that dominated and kept them weak. His was a power that raised them up. And that's our goal with parenting, right? We're trying to raise up our children to be adults, not to keep them children forever and under us
Right.
forever. A power becomes abusive when it is used to keep a person down, keep their personhood down. But it becomes beautiful when it's used to build up a person, when it's used to empower them.
Yeah, that is really quite thank you. That is really beautiful. I love the way that you depicted that. It's probably no secret, as the reluctant Christian feminist, that it is definitely an acknowledgement of some power structures that have been hurtful to women over the years that caused me to become a reluctant Christian feminist. Never a reluctant Christian, but definitely reluctant to ever use the word feminist to apply to myself.
Yeah.
But as I've delved into this topic, I see that this is not about giving women equal power. This is more about, and yes, that I think needs to happen. I think power should be given equally to all people to some degree. But I think it's also a discussion about how power is used, because
Mhm.
how we define leaders, how we define power has often been warped maybe by the way that we were raised. So I think
Mhm.
that, when we're kids, we tend to look towards authority and power as having all the answers, and maybe looking to them for who should I be and who I am. And that sometimes opens us up to influences, people who see like, oh, you should do this or you should do that when you grow up, rather than really exploring who we are. And I think that's one of the things that parents can do, is like help them discover, use their power to influence children to discover who they are versus telling them who they are. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, definitely. And one of my experiences is looking back, I can't remember a time when anybody looked at me and said, you have these gifts. You should consider using those gifts. And so I think as parents, we're to identify gifts and to help our children see who they are, who they could be, and help them to gain the skills to grow towards those things, but not in a narrowing way. I mean, we may see gifts and we may be thinking a direction that our kids just really aren't passionate about. And so parents will try to drive their children to many times it's to fulfill a dream that they didn't get,
Yeah.
or something. But our children are individuals, they're not us. And I think we are to name their gifts, we're to help them build them. And I mean, just as I just think about how God released us to make choices, even in the Garden of Eden. And we have to release others to make choices as well.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and I see in Jesus many opportunities where he invites people to participate in his ministry, like the rich young ruler. You know, he invited him to sell everything you had and follow me, and he walked away. Jesus loved him when he walked away. The Bible clearly states that he looked at him and loved him. So it's really interesting that Jesus doesn't try to manipulate or coerce or try to set things up so that we're doing things for our best interest. Obviously, what is in the best interest of the rich young ruler? It was to sell everything he had and follow Jesus. And yet Jesus loved him even though he didn't make the right choice. And I think that's also as parents, like we often are driven by fear. We want our kids to choose this thing, not that, because that thing is, you know, you'll never make money at that. You'll never be successful at that. That's a lot. That's like, there are things I wouldn't want my kids to do because, like, you're exposing yourself to so much criticism and hardship, and I wouldn't want that for you. So, like, you know, going and being a missionary, that's hard. So yeah, you're right, but let's move, obviously, with it. As a parent, we know that we have the responsibility and obligation to use our power and our influence for the good of another person. Now let's move that into a church environment. How do we use our influence and our power to help people who are in need, like victims?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question. And one of the main things that I think we need to grapple with is we need to learn how to lament in the church again and how to allow lament. I like to use parables and analogies because changing the venue, as what I call it, can help us see things from a different angle. And let's think about, like, I went to college and I graduated. I put in 4 years of work and I graduated and I got a piece of paper from it. So when we graduate, what do we want to do? What is the impulse? We want to tell people, we want to share that news, we want to celebrate with people. We've accomplished something. And there's this deep instinct to share good news. You get married, you get a new job. When there's good news, we want to share it. And the community comes around and they join in our joy. And this can help us feel deeply connected, right? A death happens. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there's a diagnosis, there's this whirlwind fight to try to cure the patient, but they end up dying. The family's in grief. They share the news with the community, and the community gathers around to grieve with them. And again, this is this deep instinct to share, and the community joins in the grief. And that helps us maintain connection at a time when there's been an abrupt disconnection that's really traumatic. But what happens with abuse? So you've got betrayal, first of all, by those who you should have had the deepest connection with, a parent, a spouse, a pastor, whoever it is. You have this betrayal. And then there's a silencing, and we'll push them, I like to use Shakespearean language, get thee to a counselor, like in Hamlet. No one wants to see or hear you. And the community others the abuse victim, often blames them. And so it just increases the disconnection. That deep instinct to share the suffering, to share what's going on, is not met. And so in psychology, they talk about the term mirroring and how important mirroring is. Like, I'm sharing something and you're reflecting back to me what I'm sharing. And I think that's what Jesus talks about, or in the, mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice, this idea. So as a community, one of the things we need to learn to do is to bring the victim back into connection through that willingness to hear the grief, willingness to mirror the grief, and then having compassion. The Bible says miracles were Jesus being moved with compassion. Until we have sat with the victim, we're not going to be able to be moved with compassion.
Yeah, that's all, like, like I never saw the weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn and joy, have joy with those who joy as mirroring, but that's exactly what that is.
Mhm,
And I have a couple of theories about why it's so hard for people to tolerate other people's experience. One is that those emotions themselves are very uncomfortable. So if somebody is angry or sad, they don't want to, maybe if somebody dies, obviously, that even then sometimes people don't show up. Like they don't
mhm,
want to be a part of that. So there's an intolerance for it. There's also maybe kind of like the same situation that makes you angry would make me sad. And so kind of like an invalidation of your response because that's not how I would respond. But then I
mhm,
also wonder, especially in the cases of abuse, where if I hear that you believe that so and so did this thing to you, then I have to like, and I actually revere that person, as often happens in the case of spiritual abuse. Like you can't say that because I've been fooled by this pastor, and I don't want to acknowledge that I've been fooled, or that somebody that I highly revered is guilty of such a thing.
yeah, that's a really big, big obstacle, and one of the things that I've thought about is how the Bible doesn't cover up the harm that the heroes of the faith caused, but
Yeah,
we in the church do. The Bible held space for that tension that, David, um, a rapist, and a murderer. And the Bible held space. And we in the church, how we do testimonies in the church, for example, testimony is always a good story in the church. Always. We never have a bad testimony. You know, you have these restaurants and they'll have bad reviews and good reviews, right?
yeah,
You'll go to read the reviews and you'll see both. But in churches, we silence the hard testimonies, the ones that are difficult to hear. And I think we need to, as a church, that's part of our why we're not growing anymore. You can't grow if you are silencing the negative. We all have faults. I mean, that's what the Bible talks about. And how do we grow from them without acknowledging that they're there? So, as a church, we have to be willing to acknowledge that we've completely failed regarding abuse. I mean, I think there's just so much evidence that as a church, what we're doing now is not working and we need to make changes.
yeah.
But
I
yeah,
agree with you. I feel like when there's a no room or no space to hear the hardship, we send the message to people who are experiencing it that we don't have, that you have to suffer alone. We don't have any space to hear you, so you have to be by yourself. And I know that most people are very reluctant to share their hard stories.
yeah. One of the things that I think about a lot as an abuse victim myself, one of the aspects that counseling helps with is to build your capacity to experience what the trauma. Because what happens, like when you're abused as a child, you had no concept for what happened to you. You're so young. You didn't have language for it. You had no preparation, nothing. It's completely overwhelming. And so your brain can't process this overwhelming thing. And so it basically chops it up, tries to hide it away from you. And so, what counselors help us do is to build up our capacity to feel those things that needed to be felt at the time, but we couldn't. And they
Right.
help us with that. And what I've come to realize is that the community also needs to learn how to do that. The abuse is also overwhelming to the community. And so, whereas, an abuse victim, we talk about dissociation, they've dissociated from the abuse. I think the community also dissociates, and they do this by dissociating from the victim. And because the abuse feels too overwhelming. I've had people say that, it's just too overwhelming. It's just too overwhelming. And once I began to realize, well, that's how I felt about my own experiences. It was too overwhelming for me to try to remember or process. I've realized that as a community, we need to learn some skills. we need to learn how to sit with abuse, which feels terribly overwhelming. But we can build our capacity because abuse victims have learned how to do that. And so the community also can.
So it sounds like you're saying that the abuse victims actually have something that can benefit the whole community, because by helping the community learn how to sit with negative emotion, they're expanding their ability to feel and maybe mirror and fulfill Jesus' commandment to mourn with those who mourn.
Absolutely. No, I just think it's so important to what you said, to recognize that abuse victims have something to offer because we're often seen as broken in a way that is unusable. But I think we have some gifts that have been that we have gained through what we've walked through.
Yeah. And I feel also that victims may represent failure of relationships. So, however you were abused, you had some sort of relationship with that abuser. Maybe it was your, pastor or boss or parent
Mhm,
or, you know, family member or something like that. And that abuse happened as a result of a relationship. So, it's almost like these things that we are almost sacred to us.
mhm,
You're a symbol of how those can be so broken.
definitely.
So what
And there,
happens to a lot of victims is that when they do come out about it or when they do look for help, is that they get silenced or shut down.
mhm. Yeah, and one of the big things, and again, I want to use a parable. Suppose somebody's in a devastating car accident, and they're not calm. They may be screaming, they may be
Yeah.
calling for help. They cannot give you a coherent story of what happened to them, right? They're struggling, and we don't come along and go, we're not going to help you because you're not calm enough, or we're not going to help you because you can't tell us clearly what happened. Or one of the big ones, we don't say, have you forgiven the guy who hit you first? Because we won't help you until you have. And I think if we could begin to see that we're doing that to abuse victims in ways that we wouldn't to somebody who's been in a car accident, I think that could really help the church. One thing that really helped me was realizing that the fall in the Bible was 4,000 years before the crucifixion. In other words, there's a process with forgiveness. It is not an instantaneous thing. If it took God 4,000 years to get from the fall to the cross, then why are we demanding victims reach forgiveness, which really isn't forgiveness? It's just getting over it. Just it's a
Yeah.
silence. It's not healing. It's silencing, and yeah, it's really problematic.
Yeah, it reminds me, speaking of process, it reminds me of the difference between salvation and sanctification. So when we accept Jesus as Savior, we're, saved. So we're accounted as having righteousness because we accept Jesus as righteousness. And yet there's this process of sanctification. There's this process of cleansing, a process of moving from glory to glory. We're not instantly given perfected minds and hearts. It takes
Mhm.
time to really develop that. And in the same way, I mean, if we're thinking of, that process, forgiveness is a part of it. It isn't instantaneous.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't think it's a given in all circumstances. In specifically because for me, one of the things that I noticed for myself was that because of the way we teach forgiveness in the church, or the way that I heard it taught, for me, Jesus came to forgive us so that we could be reconciled to the Father.
Right,
So for me, forgiveness and reconciliation are very difficult to separate. And some people you cannot reconcile with,
right.
and it's not safe. So for me, one of the things that has helped me is it's talking about it in terms of acceptance, because what we're looking for is healing, right? And people say, well, forgiveness is is a form of healing, and that's how you heal. But I think there's also healing in acceptance. So one of the things researchers have found about trauma memories is that they're very unique. They're very different from other memories. Other memories are past. They have the feeling of being in the past. But when trauma memories are there, they are present. They are not a past event. They're re-happening at the moment. You're actually living in them again. And so what I began to notice is that I was kind of stuck trying to prevent abuse that had already happened. I was still trying to prevent it. So for me, it is accepting that it happened. It's already happened, and accepting that the abuser had a choice. They had a choice on what they would do, and they chose to hurt me. I
Right.
can't stop them from doing that. I can't go back and rewrite it so that they didn't do it. The community didn't help me at the time, and I can't go back and make them have helped me in the
Mhm.
past. And so what I can do is accept that those things happened and now go, okay, now how will I respond? Because they have already happened. Now, what is my choice and what will I do? And so for me, using the framework of acceptance rather than forgiveness, because for me, they're so connected, forgiveness and reconciliation, that
Right.
I couldn't parse them out.
I can understand that. Just like the word abuse can have different meanings, the word forgiveness can have different meanings to different people. And so somebody may have all the right intentions of telling you you need to forgive, but not really realize what the weight of that word has to you. And that's, I think you cannot help somebody who's been abused in any sense without really truly listening to what's going on.
Yes, absolutely. And as a missionary who's worked um, overseas, I'm overseas right now. You really need to try to understand not just the language that people use, but their ways of thinking can be very different, and just so many aspects of life can be different. And you need to find ways to speak in such a way that they can hear what you're saying, not without. And you may think, one word is the best word, but it has this whole group of other meanings
Right.
that you're triggering in them. And so realizing that when you're communicating with somebody, you're trying to speak their language. You're not demanding that they speak yours.
I couldn't agree more. I think, I know you're a writer and I'm a writer too. And I was raised with this idea that the burden of communication is on the writer or the speaker. So if I want to communicate, I need to understand who I'm talking to, and I need to work with language that works for that person. But also, it's the idea that I'm interpreting the Bible when I tell you that you should forgive somebody. And so, unless I understand the cultural implication of what is being said in the Bible and in that particular context, I could be misinterpreting what the Bible is saying about forgiveness if I don't understand both the cultural context of what was said then and the cultural context and context and bias of the people I'm talking to now. I mean, that is such a interesting thing where you can't just take a single word and say, this is the perfect word. It's only the
Yes.
perfect word if it was the perfect word from the person you received it from, God, a truth that we received from God and the person that we're talking to.
Yeah, definitely. That's so important to understand. And and I mean, we're not saying that. I'm thinking about abuse situations where sometimes an abuser will deliberately not understand the victim and say, "Well, you just weren't speaking clearly." We're not talking about those situations. There can be, not everything is on the speaker. There can be times when the listener is using the way
True.
that they listen in order to abuse. But we're talking about how to communicate in good faith.
Yes, and I'm specifically talking about somebody who is in between what you believe you understand of truth of God to somebody who needs to hear it. So I'm not speaking as somebody who is purposefully misunderstanding somebody so that they can continue
Yes.
their obstinate way. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah.
So
I remember somebody saying to me that the parables, Jesus said that the parables were for so that people wouldn't understand. And he was like, he was telling me I should stop using parables, and I was like, well, parables kind of show the person's heart whether they're willing to do the work to understand or
Mhm.
not. And those who did the work understood what they meant. Jesus did not tell parables to keep people from understanding.
I think he's
They're
forgetting the fact that Jesus is talking about 2 audiences, those who would hear and not understand, and those who'd hear and understand, so 2
absolutely.
audiences. Don't just assume everybody's in the first, so
Mm,
let's just,
absolutely.
let's talk about if you are somebody who hears about abuse or your friend comes to you, with something a story about abuse. In some cases, I think it's possible that you might hear from somebody who doesn't even recognize that they were abused. What can someone do to be, let's just say, a good Christian friend, a good loving, and I think that's what everybody who would watch my channel would want to be, is a good, kind, loving Christian. What can they do to help somebody?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, foundations that we need to get right is the abuse victim has not been allowed to be a person. And so, too often, we want to come in and we want to take over their lives for them and drag them out of the abusive situation immediately. And then they're not coming with us. And then we get mad at them and say, well, they just want to stay there. And so we just abandon them. We need to recognize that that the abuse victim needs agency. They've had their agency stolen, they've had their voice stolen, they've had their relationship stolen. We need to help them learn how to use their own agency, not take over for them, not be angry with them because they're not leaving fast enough or whatever. Research shows it takes like 7 attempts, an average of 7 attempts to leave before an abused wife will leave her husband. And we have to have grace for that. So I think to start with is listening and asking questions, getting them to talk about their experiences. And I know the Bible in 1 Corinthians 13, it talks about love keeps no record of wrongs. With abuse, you actually do need to start keeping a record of wrongs. So helping the victim to keep a record of wrong can help them finally begin to leave because they've been taught never to look at those wrongs, to just, love covers a multitude of sins. So they're trying not to see those things, but they can be very dangerous, like choking. They were choked, but then they go back to the husband. And I think there was a recent case about that, or my friend talked to me about a friend of hers whose husband lit the house on fire because she criticized them while he lit the house on fire while she was there. And she's like, why won't my friend leave? I don't think that kind of judgment from us helps. They're tangled up, they're tied up still, and it's going to take them some time to disentangle themselves from the abuse. Abuse is deeply tangling. And like you said, a lot of times people don't even recognize that it's abuse at first. And so just helping them to identify and sometimes even to see it from outside. Like what would you think if this was happening to somebody else? How would you respond? And helping them to build the ability to leave for themselves.
Just what you said about 1 Corinthians 13 reminds me of what happens a lot of times when you're hearing somebody's story is we want to rush to fix it. Often what happens is we'll come up with a scripture that seems to fit. And if you don't know, I love the Bible. So
Yeah, me too.
I love the Bible. So and it's probably one of the reasons why, as much as I love the Bible, I really struggle when I hear somebody using the Bible as a weapon. So, you
Mhm.
hear somebody talking, about their difficult relationship with an abuser, and you automatically want to go to a scripture that says we need to forgive, we need to love, we need to be kind and compassionate. And a lot of times it's because it's opportunistic. You're thinking about these Bible verses, and that person's right in front of you, and you want to go ahead and apply a Bible verse and make it all better again. And it doesn't happen that quickly. So I think maybe it helps for a good Christian person to say, when you have verses that come up, maybe they're verses that come up because of association in your mind, not necessarily because you need to speak it out at the moment. It may not be the spirit. So probably the best thing to do is just listen and hear
Mhm.
what they're saying. Like you said, ask questions. They don't need to be told what they should do. They're probably hearing that all the time already. They're probably
Yeah.
hearing internally, I shouldn't be upset. I should just love this person. So,
And come alongside with their efforts to get free. I remember over the issue of forgiveness, I asked some of my siblings to go and confront my father with me about the abuse that had happened, and they're like, no, we've confronted him already. I think I needed to see that. Like, I needed for it to be more than just me hearing what was happening, and their refusal to come alongside me, I think, really affected me and affected my ability to make choices. And so I think it's really important that we come alongside victims, and we have to also allow them to make mistakes. They've never been allowed to make mistakes, many of them. And are they going to make mistakes? Yes, absolutely. And we need to show them that we won't abandon them because they made mistakes, because they didn't get it perfect. We do abandon them for that. We're just, another survivor talks about, he's like, he calls it the abuse of the abused. We're re-abusing the abuse victim.
and again, like you said in the very beginning of this episode, this is a pandemic. The number of people who have been abused is outrageously high.
It is. And I think we can change it. As we learn skills, I think we will make progress at cleaning up the church, at cleaning up our society. But we've got these specific things we need to learn how to do first.
And that's my point, is like with so many people being victims, and I don't know that I have any data around this. You might. I feel like
Mhm.
there's probably a greater percentage of abuse victims in the church than outside the church. Um,
It is.
because
Um,
people often go to the church because they want a sense of safety, and it's not always safe there. So,
Actually, statistics have shown that sexual abusers in the church have more and younger victims. So, yeah, the church is not safer for the victim. It is safer for the predator than any other place, which is
I
a
mean, you're
problem.
right. Our culture is about restoring people. So, like, if you have if an abuser, they're going to be, there's probably no better place to receive love, forgiveness, and restoration than in the church.
Yeah, I've got a quote somewhere. Interviewer Dr. Ann Salter, I believe it was, interviewed sex offenders, and one person told her that he considered the church a good target
Yeah.
because we're inclined to be very trusting and to think the best of people, and that's really troubling that predators can look at the church and go, hey, it's a good place. And I'm a missionary, and I've had people say to me, well, we can't deal with abuse in the church because we need to stay focused on our mission, seeking and saving the lost, and this will distract, it'll take time away. But if you have a predator in your sheepfold, frankly, the sheep will be safer outside your sheepfold than inside.
Yeah.
And trying to bring somebody in to a sheepfold that has a wolf inside of it, I believe, is frankly immoral. This is part of our mission. This is part of what we are called to do, is to make sure we have safe spaces.
Yeah. And
Um,
I don't think I've ever been into a church that hasn't needed volunteers in the children's program. And most churches do background checks, but that only catches people who are in the counties you checked who were guilty of such crimes. It doesn't catch anybody who is guilty and hasn't been caught. So it is kind of a scary place. It's actually one
that,
reason why healthy parents should volunteer in your kids' program.
yeah,
Watch over your kids while they're there.
yes, definitely. And yeah, it's a really big issue. Our churches should be safe because the thing is, people are turning to the church. Victims will often turn to the church for help, in thinking the church has promised family, they've promised safety, they've
Mhm.
promised many things. And when the church does not keep that promise, when that promise is betrayed again, then the person is worse off than they were before, because now they've tried other venues, other places, and then what they've been shown is they can't find safety anywhere.
Yeah.
And this is something that I struggled with for a really long time, is that I came to believe that I could be abused at any time in full view of everyone, and no one would lift a finger to help me. It's very difficult.
That is not unreasonable. I mean, that belief is not unreasonable. Just about a year ago, I was reading a story about a woman who was raped on a bus and people were videotaping it and no one was called. So you're right.
No,
It can happen in full view, and that is, and it isn't just the church either. There's not a lot of places where it's safe for a victim to go.
yeah, even in counseling, victims can be
Yep.
harmed again. So one of the things that helped me as I was trying to process this issue of not feeling safe anywhere is recognizing that I can make a choice. What will I do to
Mhm.
ensure that places are safe? And what can I do? What tools can I use? And for me, becoming an abuse advocate was one of the most healing things. And what I told myself, what I promised myself was, I cannot make anyone else protect you. I can't. And that's that part about acceptance. I can't force anyone, but I can promise I will do what I can to speak
Yeah.
up for you, for other victims. And it helped me move out of that frozen state. There's different responses to trauma, and the silencing and the frozenness. I remember watching a group of cheetahs take down a gazelle in the bush, and we watched it for quite a while, and it froze. And then when the cheetahs got tired and relaxed a little bit, all of a sudden it re-energized and it made a dash to try to get away. We thought it was dead. And this happened like 2 or 3 times, and it had severe wounds. But first it would freeze, and then when it seemed like the cheetahs were not looking or whatever, it would try to get away again. And I felt like I had been stuck in the freeze state for a really long time. And now, and the times that I tried to flee weren't working. So I've learned better ways for me to speak up about abuse that are more effective than the flight
Yeah.
efforts I did before, but also just not being frozen anymore, not being silenced anymore is just so important for many abuse victims. And one of the things that I've noticed is that I mentioned how the church wants the victims to get over it. What we're defining as healing is not actually healing. Some of the things that people should have recognized as signs of healing for me, they interpreted as signs of lack of healing and like continuing to speak about it,
Yeah.
becoming an advocate. You haven't healed yet. No, this is actually a step towards healing. This is really important. It's been very empowering. I talked about how important empowering is. So learning maybe to change some of our definitions would be really helpful for the church.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you for reading my mind, because that was my next question, is how can we as individuals be a safe person? You went right into that. So thank you. But just as a reminder that we are surrounded by victims all over us, people who've been abused at times in their youth or in their childhood. And it doesn't have to be sexual abuse. It could be all sorts of abuse. And it could be somebody in their 60s or 70s
Mhm,
who looks healed because they've suppressed their emotions or they've dissociated for most of their life. And I think that we need to be like mindful that when
mhm,
somebody is finally speaking up, that it could trigger for them a lot of emotions that maybe they haven't felt in a long time. Can we be
mhm,
patient? Can we be kind? Can we give them a space and energy and time to process their emotions and to affirm their value as a human being, not like, you're, some sort of victim. And also, as a body, whether this happened to me or not, and it did happen to me, but whether this happened to me or not, as a Christian, we share these wounds. So
mhm.
a victim of any person in the church is a victim. It victimizes the whole church. It victimizes all of us. It suppresses the gifts and abilities and agency of that person to operate in the way that God intended them to operate. So, it's our Christian duty to address the wounds within the church, just as though we would address physical wounds in a body.
Yeah, there was a story that I watched some years ago. I don't know if you ever saw it. There was a wrestler, an African American wrestler, high school wrestler, changed the rules so that dreadlocks could not be, I mean, just before the event, they changed the rules so that his dreadlocks were too long. And there was no reason that I could see for it. And so he has to choose at this event whether to submit to the rules or forfeit his match. And so, what I kept seeing all of his teammates, many of them white, coming and patting him on the back and encouraging him, but none of them said, "We'd rather lose this match, lose this competition, than have you be forcibly have your dreads cut." And I noticed a lot of people were like so proud of those teammates for patting this guy on the back. And I kept thinking, why didn't anyone say, "You're more important than this match"? And dehumanizing you is more important than winning, is
Yeah.
so important that we would rather forfeit the match than participate in dehumanizing you. And then when he's agreed to have his dreadlocks cut, this I think it was a white woman, put rubber gloves on even to do this. I don't think I've ever had anybody put rubber gloves on to cut my hair. And I was just thinking, why don't we step in? Why do we see it as more loving to pat somebody on the back when they're suffering instead of doing anything to stop it? If that makes any sense. I feel like
Yeah.
we're saying keep warm and well fed, like the Bible talks about, instead of doing anything to ensure safety. And we're interpreting those actions of patting the person on the back and going, well, see, that's love. But maybe love would say no. Maybe we need to start seeing that sometimes love needs to be more active and not just
Yeah.
patting a person on the back.
Yeah, and to be, I think that I don't know anything about the story, but I think as a teenager, many of them may not be prepared for knowing how to stand up against injustice. But I
Right.
think with as much injustice as there is in the world, maybe that's a skill we could learn, how to stand up
Absolutely.
against injustice, how to stand with a friend and say, "No, if my friend can't play with dreadlocks, then I'm going to step away. I'm going to default," or whatever the term is in wrestling. I don't know anything about wrestling.
I don't know either. I
Yeah.
just remember that story and just seeing how differently I interpreted it than everybody else around me.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I do think it is a skill we need to learn. And abuse has to be stopped. I mean, it is so bad. We need to learn the skills to stop it. It and I honestly believe that, the Bible tells us to pay attention to the signs of the times. And anybody who is paying any attention will see report after report after report after report coming out about the church's failure to address abuse. And with the SBC, former vice president of the SBC, Boto, said this is Satan at work. Well, no, it is truth that's coming out, and the Spirit is the one that Jesus promised would lead us into all truth. Where we see the truth coming out, I think we have to recognize that it's the Spirit at work. And so I believe the Spirit is clearly at work in calling out the church's failures regarding abuse. And so right now we've got a choice. Will we quench the Spirit or will we join in the work of the Spirit?
Yeah. And a bulk of our discussion today has really been about supporting abuse victims. We haven't really talked about the other side of the coin, and that is fighting against injustice. But
Mhm.
clearly, if we love somebody, we will come alongside them. We will listen. We will give them space to heal. We will recognize that they want to heal, but it takes time. Just like if somebody has like a chronic illness or an illness that they're trying to recover from, that's part of love. But the other part of love is standing against injustice. Hopefully we can learn how to stand when we see injustice in the world. Maybe it means that we quit our jobs, or we walk away from a church, or these are really uncomfortable decisions to make, and I'm not saying that that's what people ought to do, but I do
Mhm.
think that everyone ought to think about what is the right thing for me to do in this situation to be a loving and kind person. And it may not look like harmony and love and joy and good feelings. It could look like mourning and suffering, and it could mean walking away. So,
Yeah, I'm part of a church. There's a church here in Kenya. It's part of the Vineyard movement, which the Vineyard says that they empower women at all areas, all levels of ministry. But our church is actually moving away from that here. And for me, as an abuse victim, and as a abuse researcher, I've seen so many things that concern me about that move, in terms of abuse. And so, I mean, I've faced the question, will I leave? Some other women and I have decided, we're going to try a little bit first. We're going to try to speak up and try to have our voice heard first and have our voice considered. And so you won't always just leave right away when there's something that concerns you. That isn't
Mhm.
always the best decision. Coming together as a group is a really healthy decision, because one person trying to speak up isn't safe. I mean, you're talking about somebody who has power over others. And so, just one person going isn't healthy. You do need community. And this is where we need to learn how to be a team sport, I guess, and how to really, really work together. And I think if we do work together, we can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. You're reminding me of all the history lessons we have about governing and governing people, where there's abuse of power, like in the hands of a king. People have in the past stood together against abuses of power. And we did that as Americans. We did that in our Revolutionary War, and in the Magna Carta. The people stood against the powers of a king. And
Yeah.
I think the same thing here. When we see abuse, having like a pastor has a lot of influence and power. There's no doubt about it. The SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, has a lot of power and influence. There's no doubt about it. But what checks that power often are the masses. So we may seem insignificant
Yeah.
individually, but when we stand together, when we stand with those people, when we recognize that the abuse that happened to my sister is like abuse that happened to me, because we are family, we are sisters in the Lord, that is where we have the opportunity to make a difference. And as an individual, maybe the only difference I can do for now is by living and listening and giving space to my friends one on one. But if we can
Hmm.
stand together, that is a different form of power. That's against the structures. So we can stand with people individually, and as a group, we can stand against structures.
Yeah. And I believe that sitting with the abuse is what will build up in us the urge to stand up. Does that make any sense? So the Jesus being moved with
Absolutely.
compassion, movement will come only after we've sat and listened.
Yeah.
And so that's really, really important. And that's part of what recognizing that I think about the passage, how can they hear unless somebody's been sent to speak the message.
Yes,
And we need people speaking, and then we need people hearing, and then we need people believing, and then we need people acting on what's happened. But it's a process, and we've got to
absolutely.
get all of there.
And you probably have the words for this. I only have like experience and that sort of thing. But when you first hear about some abuse that's happened in somebody's life, I mean, I think sometimes our first response is no, no, that denial, like that couldn't have happened. And then, like you said, that acceptance. And the longer that you sit with that injustice, the more, this is personal experience. I don't get angry at first. I have the denial that happens first, and then the sadness that happens. But then when I sit with it for a while, I can get pretty angry.
Hmm.
And
And anger is so important too. It's a really important stage. The emotions we label as negative, I think, are really important. Anger, bitterness, resentment, hatred, they are really important. And I know it sounds really weird, but the Bible talks about Jesus or God having emotional responses to things. I mean,
right,
my brother used to go, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, because he believes in predestination and all of this. But I remember finding a verse in one of the prophets, and it was talking about Israel and God saying, I've hated her for, her abandonment of him.
abandonment, yeah,
And going, what I've learned to recognize is that we need to make a distinction between responses and the actions that cause the response. And so one way I talk about this, the Bible talks about the bitter root, right? But there's also bitter herbs that are supposed to be on the Passover table. So they're to get rid of the bitter root, but the bitter herbs are to be on the Passover table to remind them of the bitterness of slavery, right? And the blessing of the Exodus. So they're not to get rid of the bitter herb, they're to get rid of the bitter root. Well, a root is what things grow from, right?
Mhm.
Herb is what grows out.
Mhm.
And so too often we're saying to abuse victims, we're trying to get rid of the bitter root, so you need to get rid of your bitterness. But their bitterness is a response. It's a leaf.
Right.
The bitter
I see what
root is
you're
the
saying.
abuse. The bitter
Yeah.
root is the abuse. And so we need to make a distinction. I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, think about it. If you've got a serious medical issue going on, and so you're in a lot of pain, and if you just give Tylenol or an opioid or something to remove the pain, that won't really solve anything, right?
Right.
You need to treat the problem. And I
Right.
think people are not understanding that this is what we're doing when we're just trying to get rid of the victim's response to abuse. We're basically just giving them an opioid or a Tylenol for a serious issue. And so the response will change once we have dealt with the abuse.
I was just going to say, I think we can look at our own lives and see how, the emotions are either an inappropriate or appropriate response to something. So if I'm angry because somebody cut me off in traffic, I need to work on me, right?
Yes.
Because that is just my response, and I'm not going to be able to, there are also very legitimate reasons why people might have cut me off, like I might have been speeding or they didn't see me or whatever. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they messed up and cut me off and it was personal. But if I'm angry because of some injustice, I don't need to
Hmm.
fix my anger.
Right.
And in some senses, we don't have any power. So if you are, and I hate to use an extreme, but I'm going to use it because it clearly they don't have any power. If you are a Holocaust victim and you're in imprisonment and you don't have any power, anger really isn't going to help you in that particular sense. But where you do have power, where can you
Hmm.
use that anger to do something constructive to address the injustice? So Jesus overturned the tables, and we can sit with our friends and we can leave churches that are, not right, or we can leave relationships that are not right. So
Yeah, or call out people. I remember a
use
pastor friend of mine that I went through seminary with. I was being hurt by another friend from seminary. I would consider it abusive. And, I asked him to speak to his friend about what was happening to me. And he told me he agreed that what was happening to me was wrong and was hurtful. But he said he didn't feel called to write to our mutual friend and tell him that. What he did feel called upon to do was to tell me that I needed to change my emotions.
mm,
And it was a year of him sending me messages telling me I needed to change myself. And I kept thinking, did he not need to pray about whether to speak to me? He never saw anything wrong with that. And when I tried to talk to him about it, that basically ended the relationship. He told my husband, I don't know what to say. And I think we need to reckon with this. The fact that I think you said something about this, that we're interpreting things, verses, the Bible or whatever, from our preconceptions. And I think we have some preconceptions that make us see. This is the way I phrase it to a lot of people: make it seem as though it is worse to bleed when you are knifed than it is to knife somebody.
yeah. But it's
Yeah,
safer to address the victim, than it is the perpetrator.
it
It
is.
it feels safer for me as an onlooker, and I think that's what we're talking a lot, is like, what is the righteous response of an onlooker? As an onlooker, it's so much easier for me to address you and your sin than it is for me to address the perpetrator and put myself in a vulnerable spot.
Definitely. And that's why I think it's really important that we build communities that do it as a team. It can't be a one person thing. And one thing I think is that, the abuser has struck a blow, if that makes any sense. And as long as we don't step in, all the weight of that blow is going to land on the victim.
Mhm.
But when we as a community step in, the blow can be diffused across people, but it's hard for us to have that suffering with somebody, a willingness to do that suffering with somebody, to absorb some of the blow with them. But one analogy that I've used that I think is really powerful to talk about broken arms, right? I mean, you have children, I have children. We're trying as parents to be as make sure that everything is as safe as they could be. But we cannot guarantee that our children will never ever experience a broken arm as much as we do. So, is the broken arm the worst damage that could be done to them with the broken arm?
No.
No. The failure to treat the broken arm is the worst damage.
Yeah.
And it's really counterintuitive to realize that what the onlookers do in response to abuse actually causes more harm than the abuser themselves. But it's true. And I think we need to be able to sit with that and realize that really is true, because abuse causes immense harm, but if it's treated in a timely fashion, treated healthily, the abuse victim will be in a healthier place than if they are not.
Yeah, I remember reading that children who go through very harmful events less likely to experience the long-term consequences of that event if they have somebody with them at that time. And what I find most heartbreaking about your story is not only the abuse you suffered as a victim, as a child, but the many opportunities that people had to come alongside you and help you, and you didn't receive that. You received a lot of people who dismissed your very real hurt. And it's really, I find it very condemning, not condemning, convicting to hear you say, as onlookers, we have more potential to damage a victim than the original perpetrator when we don't listen to them or when we dismiss them. That's very hurtful. I mean, that's so hard to hear because I wonder if I have at times not been safe. So,
Well, I remember being told, and I honestly don't know if this happened or not. So at the time when I was still struggling with abuse myself and hadn't recognized it in any significant way, so my mind turned anything that was too stressful into a dream that I didn't know whether was real or not, but usually they were real. But somebody came and told me that she was being abused, this dream that I had. And so I wonder, did somebody come to me and tell me that she was being abused? And my mind just couldn't handle it at the moment because I hadn't even processed my own abuse. And that grieves me that I wasn't there for that person. And so this is part of why it's for me it's so important that we as a church learn how to build our capacity to hear these
yeah.
stories, because I didn't have the capacity to hear my own story, so I didn't have the capacity to hear anyone else's. But I'm hoping that if somebody tells me in the future that I will do better than that dream that I had that may be real. um,
So if we have been guilty of maybe not hearing somebody or dismissing something, maybe because of our own abuse, maybe because of our own difficulties of dealing with our own emotions, let this be the moment where we turn it around, where we make a conscious and intentional effort to listen to people that are talking about something that happened to them. Let us
yeah,
make space for their emotions. They could be ugly, and that's okay.
definitely. And we can do better. And I think we will do better. I think I'm seeing this change. I'm seeing, I talked about how I'm seeing, all of these stories being brought out, but I'm also seeing a lot of victims who are really stepping forward and speaking and being honest where they are, being honest that they're still struggling. And I'm seeing the community starting to step into that role. I mean, obviously, it's not anywhere near where it needs to be, but I do believe it is changing.
Yeah. Yeah, so there is hope. There's hope for this moment being different than the previous one and moving forward and helping people that are in our circle, helping where we can. This isn't a huge channel, but I am so grateful for you have such great expertise and you have such a story that can relate to a lot of people. And I appreciate you being, willing to share that. And I hope that it makes a difference for somebody, even if it's just one person, because every person is worth being valued and being understood.
Yeah, and I just really want to say thank you for inviting me to be on this podcast. I've never been invited onto a podcast before, so this was a huge thing for me, and it was really important for for me to be able to speak, and so I really thank you. I really, really appreciate you, and I really appreciate what you're doing with the Reluctant Christian Feminist. I'm right there with you. I didn't want to be a feminist, and it took me a really long time to get there, but I am there, and it it's because of seeing the need and seeing the value. And you've talked about history, with the Magna Charta and the Revolutionary War and such. And I've just been studying with my kids the importance of the feminist movement and some of the amazing changes. I mean, it's only been 100 years since women have been allowed to vote. So I grew up with my dad telling me I shouldn't be allowed to vote because I'm a woman or a girl at the time, but I'm really grateful for the work of feminists. So thank you for your work.
Absolutely. Thank you for being willing to share. And I hope you get on a lot more podcasts. I hear, because we only touched the surface of what you know, because not only have you gone through what you've gone through, but you have accumulated so much research and knowledge about this topic. So I know that you have so much more to share than what you've shared here. We're just limited by time and we're over an hour already, but
Thank you.
every second. Thank you so much for coming on. Listeners or viewers, I want to thank you for staying through to the very end and hearing, our sister talk about her experiences and share her expertise. So thank you very much. God bless you. Like and subscribe.